The story, or poem rather, titled Child Roland to the Dark Tower Came, written by Robert Browning, is a work of art that I happen to have found myself reading recently, and it struck me with a strange kind of resonance that I hadn't quite anticipated. In truth, a myriad of writers have either referenced or expanded upon the work somehow over the centuries, from the short story itself deriving from a Shakespearean play from the early 17th century, all the way to Stephen King's very own Dark Tower series in the late 1970s, with each story still managing to somehow return to Browning's very own haunting vision of a solitary figure trudging towards an inevitable confrontation with one's own fate. Yet, when I had first encountered the tale, the connection that I drew almost immediately in my own mind was not in the form of literary, but rather in the form of interactive entertainment. It was the story of Batman Arkham Asylum, to stop beating around the bush. I know Browning's original poem and Rocksteady's game aren't directly connected by any means of the metric, but you have to admit they still share an odd kind of structural kinship with one another that runs a little deeper than mere influence. Both are built on the idea of a single figure or person navigating their way through a confined, almost allegorical landscape where every obstacle is less a physical barrier and more of a manifestation of the self and one's own true fears. For Roland, the wasteland is a test of one's own endurance and meaning. For Batman, the asylum is both a fortress of his greatest enemies and a mirror of his own psyche. The deeper he ventures inward to the establishment, the more the walls seem to echo back fragments of his own memory, trauma, and his inner self-doubt. I also feel as if this is a very interesting way to pick apart the character of Batman without going as far as to retcon certain aspects of the character that everybody has come to accept as cold hard fact. Because let's be real here, it's not like Batman is someone who even needs an introduction in the first place. The equally as captivating as it is a tragic story of an 8-year-old kid witnessing both of his parents be horrifically gunned down right before his very eyes, only for him to later grow up to become the vengeful Dark Knight, is a story that's practically been beaten into the heads of everybody by the year of 2025. And that ritual started as early as the late 1960s with Adam West, long before me or you or anyone really had any kind of say in the matter if we're being real. For decades now, various writers and/or directors have both juggled and struggled with the tantalizing idea of reinventing the story of Batman in one way or another, only for them to immediately realize the staggering amount of weight that comes with that sentiment. Some movies and animated television series were able to successfully retell the story of Batman in their own respected ways while also critically resonating with target audiences by the end of the late 2000s. But as far as video games went, there weren't very many noteworthy or successful examples of Batman breaking his way through to the threshold of video games, despite the already handful of attempts by that time. That all changed, however, when Batman Arkham Asylum released in August of 2009. In my opinion, this Batman game managed to excel past the limits of its predecessors mainly due to how Rocksteady faithfully committed to a clear design thesis and then built every one of the game's core systems, like the stealth, the combat, the exploration, and even the things like its story delivery, so closely around that same thesis. The goal here wasn't just to make the player feel like the most methodically effective combat tactician there is, who also just so happens to be the world's smartest detective at the same time, but also to make the player feel like Batman, in every matter of the phrase. And Rocksteady was able to pull this off not by expanding the sheer scale or amount of everything being presented to the player, but instead they did it by constraining most of it, which also kind of ironically plays back into the whole theme of what a good depiction of Batman is in general, but I'm not really so sure if this was done with as much intention as some of the other ideas in this game clearly had behind them. The decision to confine the player to Arkham Asylum is way more than just a narrative notion. It's also a structural choice that ensures focus. Instead of giving players an open city, Rocksteady presents a curated, hub-like labyrinth to players, filled with meticulously detailed courtyards, medical wings, botanical gardens, and industrial annexes that have been woven together into one big Metroidvania-like structure. Which, just in case you're unfamiliar, is a term that basically means a game's level design consists of the player backtracking in order to progress, when the map is laid out in a wing-like format, and when that certain rooms are designed to test a specific pillar of the player's skill set at a time. In that way, a gating progression behind gadgets and ability unlocks then turns backtracking into discovery, layering extra meaning onto spaces that the player thought they had already mastered or already cleared earlier in their playthrough. Believe it or not, this place is not just a sandbox, despite the intoxicating amount of power fantasy that's constantly on display. It's a character in itself, and it's also controlled, intimate, and absolutely dripping with gothic atmosphere practically everywhere you step foot. I really mean it when I say that too. Every hallway feels like it's been authored rather than artificially generated. And with the recent habit or trend of AAA development studios using AI for some of the more minor details here and there as a means to cut corners as much as possible, it only makes games like Arkham Asylum stand out so much more to me knowing that almost every aspect of this game was put under the magnifying lens, so to speak. Literally every element of this game was carefully crafted with just as much passion and realism as possible, all the way down to the way Batman's cape moves in the wind. And if you think I'm full of shit or exaggerating that last part a bit, there's actually a really good Eurogamer.com interview with Robert Purchase I'll leave linked in the description, along with all the other sources I've used for this video, where the then president of Eidos Interactive, Ian Livingstone, had this to say when he was questioned about the abrupt delay of Arkham Asylum back in May of 2009, and it actually proves all of what I just said. Quote, "We're delaying it for the right reasons, and no one is going to be disappointed because we put an enormous effort into it. For example, there was one person working on nothing but the cape for 2 whole years, so that means there are over 700 animations and sound clips attached to the cape alone. That's why it looks so beautifully realistic." End quote. Now, that sounds like a ridiculous amount of time in retrospect, but when you realize that the cape is going to be in the center of the player's screen 90% of their playthrough, it could totally make or break their overall experience if it doesn't look somewhat appealing or if it doesn't behave in a realistic way. And little aspects like that are so mind-boggling for me to hear because I would have never thought of something like that being so important as it is if I was the lead artist in charge of this game. Sometimes I daydream about being a video game developer or a technical artist that's somehow involved in the organization of a great video game, but then when I hear stories like this and take into account that this is actually close to what that kind of job is most of the time, it sort of reassures me and comforts me that my current occupation doesn't ask me to do anything this major or consistent for such a long period of time. But at the same time, it's that kind of level of special, pure dedication to one's craft that was able to propel this game and its artwork above so many others in my opinion. The game's most notable feature, however, is undoubtedly the free-flow combat system, which effortlessly manages to translate Batman's comic book combat into gameplay mechanics that reinforce the player maintain the rhythm of the fight over memorizing a certain button pattern or combination. Which also makes sense as to why it's designed that way when you learn that the combat was originally going to be a rhythm-based idea, but that was scrapped in favor of free flow. Here, enemies broadcast their intentions with very readable animations, rewarding the player's precision over their button mashing skills. Plus, it really does give every encounter the cinematic weight of a choreographed brawl that you would see in one of the movies or something like that, even if the slow-mo is a bit overused for my own personal taste. Meanwhile, the Predator encounters invert that power dynamic entirely, which is kind of odd when you take into consideration that this is a Batman game after all. In the stealth sequences, Batman is not just a tank absorbing damage. Instead, he's a fragile, vulnerable phantom controlling the tempo through fear over all else, and the player really gets to revel in this as much as they want at times. In this area of the game, things like vantage points and line-of-sight manipulation are crucial factors that end up determining how every event plays out. Each takedown isn't just an action, it's also a performance that needs to be done in a sequence to, sound good. These encounters are staged in a way that makes the player feel like a tactician rather than a brawler, which is really cool, and Detective Vision plays into this heavily. Detective Vision is often critiqued for how it desaturizes the game's art direction, and because it is kind of overpowered in more ways than one when you actually think about it. But its real achievement isn't in how easy it makes the game. It's how it's able to externalize Batman's intellect over all of his other gadgets at the player's disposal. Environmental puzzles, forensic investigations, and the game's take on collectibles, aka the Riddler trophies, all fold into a sense that Batman's greatest strength isn't his brute force or cunning resilience, but it's actually his ability to solve a problem faster and more thoroughly than anyone else in the room with him. And the game's narrative delivery complements this in almost every way too, through audio logs, scattered riddles, and not even to mention, the presence of the animated series' voiced cast here kind of lends Arkham Asylum a sense of continuity with Batman's broader legacy while still keeping the story tightly centered on the Joker's orchestrated gauntlet most of the time. The Scarecrow hallucinations are where the game shines the most in my opinion though, but I would be far from the first critic to tell you that. They collapse the game's mechanics, the player's perspective, and the overarching narrative into one big, surreal, side-scrolling set piece that literalizes Batman's psychology onto the platforms he's climbing on. Which proves that Rocksteady understood at an early age as a development studio that immersion wasn't only about realism, it was about embodiment as well. Unfortunately for Arkham Asylum, its most hollow areas are its boss fights and overall boss design in general. Which really sucks to say because these parts of a game can really help it shine if given enough thought and effort put into them. In Arkham Asylum, though, every major or semi-major boss in this game is just a reskin of Bane and his attack pattern. And normally I wouldn't harp too much on this, but you fight Bane kind of early on in the story, so therefore, every time a new mutant thug appears with a kind of dumbed-down version of his moveset, it just isn't that fun to fight, bloated health bar or not. And this kind of enemy variation is used all the way up until the final boss too, so there's no real avoiding it. But, to do a little 180 if I may, the game's casting is beyond superb. The choice to cast the Batman the Animated Series alumni here helps ground the world the game's trying to build in a familiar vocal register in most audiences' ears, and the writing bridges comic book melodrama with psychological unease in a very unique way. Meaning, not only are players blessed with the iconic voices of Kevin Conroy's cunning depiction of Batman, Mark Hamill's exotically crazy Joker, Arlene Sorkin's lovely exaggerated Harley Quinn, Tasia Valenza as an emotional Poison Ivy, but the story is even written by Paul Dini, the man who wrote the animated series himself. So it kinda helps make these two forms of media feel connected in a way that I know that they aren't. I think this was a brilliant decision because not only does it trigger a hint of nostalgia in the older audience members that maybe grew up watching the show that are playing the game, but it also introduces the younger age range to these talented voice actors as well, because this game was rated T for teen after all. My mother never really got into video games in the same way that me or the way that other people in my family have, but she did grow up watching the Batman animated series on television when she was younger, and she loves that series to death. So much so that I'm willing to bet that the full box set of the entire show is still sitting in her room in the same position that I remember it being whenever I was growing up, right now when I'm writing this. And when I remember back to first getting the game as a kid, and when she originally heard that the Batman in the video game she just bought me sounded the exact same as the Batman she had grown up with, even she thought that shit was pretty cool, man. Coming from a non-gamer. And it really is when you begin to truly think about it for a second. There aren't too many other beloved IPs where this kind of situation could have unfolded in, and although I was just happy at the time because my mother liked something that I also found enjoyable, she probably appreciated that moment a whole lot more than me at the time because in a very small way, it meant that I was also getting the chance to grow up with something that she was familiar with, or familiar to what she had grown up with. When all of this is taken together, Arkham Asylum is not only a rare example of what gaming as a medium could achieve, but it's also a perfect example of what happens when a game masters ludonarrative consonance. What I mean when I say that is, it's a game where the mechanics, the setting, and the story all converge on a similar goal of letting the player feel like Batman, all while simultaneously asking the player, who is Batman? It is this purity of vision, not just in its innovations, that explains why later entries, though larger, louder, and more technically advanced, could never entirely capture the same tight coherence, or rather the lightning-in-a-bottle kind of magic that came alongside Rocksteady's first attempt at the Batman formula. Before I actually get started, though, I feel as if there is something I have to clarify. I know how I had just mentioned that I had grown up with the Rocksteady Batman games, and technically due to how much I had played them whenever I was younger, you could say that that was true. But I must admit, I never once beat any of these games for myself whenever I was a child, or even as a teenager if I'm being 100% honest with you right now. At that time in my life, these games were far too dark for my own liking personally, and by the time I'd gotten into high school and these games had already been on the shelves for more than a few years at that point, I'd kind of just accepted that these were great games and I was just simply out of luck for not spending enough time with them to beat them for myself when I was younger. It wasn't until I decided to sit down and revisit these games about a few years after I'd graduated that the tremendous praise and admiration that everyone collectively carries for these titles actually started to click with me. And that's also when the game's core themes began to deeply resonate with me as well. For the longest time while growing up, I had always heard that these games were based on the comics, and that Rocksteady aimed to create one of the most comic-accurate Batman portrayals yet. But it wasn't until recently that I found out that the comic they chose to reference so heavily was none other than Grant Morrison and Dave McKean's 1989 comic titled Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, which is often just shortened into something like Batman Arkham Asylum, long before this game came out, funny enough. This graphic novel is widely considered to be one of the best Batman stories ever written, and supposedly was made as a form of protest to the rising theme of pseudo-realism that was growing in the comic space in the time of the late 80s, like Alan Moore's The Watchmen and Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Rises. In interviews, Morrison has stated that the intent of the comic was to create something that was more like a piece of music or an experimental film rather than the typical adventure comic book, which is why in it you see Batman behaving in ways that are so unfamiliar to how the audience might recall the character. Morrison chose to approach Batman from the point of view of a more dreamlike, emotional, and irrational hemisphere, which is ultimately what makes it stand out so much in my opinion, similarly to how The Batman Who Laughs does in the minds of the more casual Batman fans. One of the very first things to stick out to me about Batman Arkham Asylum is how the game doesn't open up with a fight scene or an epic chase sequence, or even some villain monologuing over a Gotham City in flames. Instead, it opens with a solemn drive through Gotham. Batman has the Joker in his custody and he's bringing him back to Arkham Asylum, where he belongs. Now, on paper, that sounds more like an ending to a Batman story rather than the beginning of one, but Rocksteady treats this story beat with a ton of care. The Joker is certainly being restrained, but he isn't outright resisting or even does he appear to be upset in any way. He's actually grinning, joking, and treating the whole affair as if it was some sort of theater, even going as far as to make a remark about how the warden's greeting that loops on repeat at the opening doors is his favorite TV show, suggesting that he's seen it a lot of times. And in a weird way, he's not actually wrong. This is theater to a certain degree. Batman plays the stoic lead, the guards are the chorus of routine, and the asylum itself is not only the stage where everyone else has been rehearsing for a play only the Joker knows is about to happen, but it's also going to inadvertently help the Joker in every way possible as well, making us sort of a co-antagonist in the process. So in that way, the opening actually does 3 jobs all at once. It explains why this night is so significant to Batman, it establishes the Joker as the showman-in-chief, and it turns the asylum itself into the protagonist it deserves to be in this story. From a design standpoint, this is all very crucial for the player. By shrinking the world, Rocksteady forces density and intention into every corridor, turn, and encounter. That's what makes the opening so effective too. It's not about the action, it's about setting the mood, about how the asylum feels like a place that swallows you alive the second you step foot into it. The camera lingers behind Batman as he walks through all these corridors and elevators and on the sterile light of the hallways against the beautiful mix of Gothic stone and late Victorian architecture. Not because this is a video game and it's supposed to be pretty and because the FOV is fixed after all, but because the player is also supposed to be scanning their environments and taking everything in just like Batman is right now. This isn't a cutscene you watch while waiting for the game to begin, it is the beginning. It's teaching you that Arkham Asylum isn't just a backdrop like it would have been used in most other video games. Here, it's just as crucial as any other aspect of the plot. And that same concept also rests at the heart of Grant Morrison and Dave McKean's comic. There, Arkham is less an institution and more of a living mind in itself, a place that reflects the madness it contains until it all starts to slowly blur with Batman's own psyche. In that comic, the Joker wants Batman to undergo the same kind of tests he went through when he was brought to the asylum originally that deemed him too unfit to maintain his, status in society. And the whole conflict there is that Batman doesn't want to because deep down, he's afraid the Joker is right. Rocksteady doesn't adapt that book directly into Arkham Asylum, but it does something even more interesting to me. It carries that same kind of philosophy forward here in the video game format. Both works understand Arkham as a mirror, a place where the walls themselves are complicit. Both works use Joker as connective tissue for the story. A figure who treats Arkham not as a prison, but as a stage where Batman's true identity can be unmade. Morrison's Joker is mercurial and theatrical, slipping into different personas like costumes, while Rocksteady's is more of a traditional rendition of what might come to the player's mind when they think of the iconic killer clown. Equipped with his classic purple formal suit, white skin, realistically looking fading green hair, and of course his red smile outline like lipstick. Plus, he breaks into psychotic laughter at the end of most sentences, and the way he can jump from sarcastic babbling to an intense and threatening tone is just so perfect. Like, Mark Hamill really knew what he was doing when he played this character, man.
I thought I told you to stay quiet!
Oh, Frankie, you really should learn to keep that fat mouth of yours shut. It'll get you into trouble.
But regardless, In both cases of the story, Joker's role is pretty much the same. Not to kill Batman outright, but to destabilize him. To pull at the seams of the mask until what's underneath is slowly but surely exposed. And not in the physical sense though, of course. The Joker could care less about who Batman actually is, he just wants to see what makes him tick deep down. When the trap finally springs, things tend to unspool rather quickly. The Joker's plan isn't really a single cunning reveal so much as it is an entire night-long program of Batman-themed theatrical hijinks. It doesn't take very long for the Joker to get control over the asylum, and when he does, guards are neutralized, systems are no longer reliable, and the PA system becomes Joker's personal megaphone for the rest of the game, which is, kind of funny. Inmates and marquee villains are liberated not solely to fight Batman, but also to populate the asylum with spectacle, making the narrative therefore proceed as a sort of escalating series of tests rather than a linear mystery, although this is technically still a very linear game on paper. This is also where players are properly introduced to the free-flow combat system, although I think it's pretty safe to mention that I don't think Rocksteady ever genuinely explains how great the system actually is or how it even fully functions to the player, probably due to how most of the abilities behind it are locked behind skill point upgrades, but I digress. Most people probably just dove in and figured it out on their own after enough incorrect inputs or improper rhythm management. And due to how simple the system is, it is kinda just easy to pick up that sort of thing and do it. Upon revisiting the game especially, the system itself feels a lot slower and clunkier in this game than it shapes up to be in the later titles, but that's really just me nitpicking more than it is me offering anything kind of critical. Honestly, I don't have anything critical to say about the system, despite how this video falls under the review category technically. It's a system that I can confidently say still holds up today, and is undoubtedly one of the most innovative and eye-catchingly designed combat systems to bless the realm of video games in the last 2 decades. And I'm definitely not the first person who sat here and wasted a little over 200 words describing what easily could have been said as, "It's hella fun, man," and you probably would have still agreed with me. Once the ball starts rolling a little bit though, and Batman steps a little further into the asylum, he eventually runs into Zsasz, who's holding one of the guards hostage and is more than willing to execute him in front of a live studio audience, prompting Batman/the player to use a stealth mode in order to take him down. This is also about the time when Harley Quinn is properly introduced to the player as she fills Batman in on a little bit of what's going on here, revealing that she's kidnapped Warden Quincy Sharp, who's a Rocksteady original character for this game, who I'm pretty sure is meant to mirror Amadeus Arkham, like the original creator of the Arkham Asylum, but I'm not 100% sure there, I'm just kind of drawing conclusions. Apparently, one of the 2 most controversial decisions that Rocksteady reportedly had during the development of this game was the changing of Harley Quinn's original outfit from the iconic black and red one piece to the hypersexualized dress kind of version that we get to see in Arkham Asylum. Some people thought it wasn't true to the character that Dini had originally wrote, and therefore it shouldn't have been altered or overtly sexualized as much as it was. But before you get any hasty thoughts, rest assured, because I'm not going to sit here and be the guy that tries to debate the ethics of women's attire in comic books, mainly because that's a discussion that's been going on long before I was even born, but also because I feel like there's nothing I could really add to that, nor would I even be the first guy to bring this up in Arkham Asylum critiques. Some of the more negative reviews of the game that I came across to state that Harley Quinn was dramatically sexualized in a way that either didn't fit their character or the overall narrative entirely. That was when they weren't busy criticizing the game's semi-clunky and idiotically designed stealth sequences, of course. And although that last part has a little bit of weight, I'll admit, I don't really think this is something that is so out of character for somebody like Harley Quinn as much as people like to paint it out to be. Nor do I even think this is something big enough to even critique personally. In my own personal opinion of the matter, if one of the biggest complaints fans have with your Batman game is the outfit that Harley Quinn is flaunting, then you've made a pretty damn good Batman game in my eyes. But at the same time, I'm also not a woman, and this specific incident doesn't really apply to me as much on a fundamental level as some of the other areas of the game do that I have a problem with, but I'll address them when they come up in the story later on. The next story beat arrives when Batman confronts the Joker, but instead of getting to tango with him, he has to beat up on a random inmate who's been injected with a mutated version of Bane's Titan virus. This is going to become a reoccurring theme in this game's story, so much so that I would go as far as to say it was a crutch of some kind, or at least it gets used as a crutch when Rocksteady can't figure out how to properly challenge the player anyway. And what I mean when I say that is, when the game is done presenting its philosophy and moral questioning to the player, Rocksteady normally just throws a few Titan enemies into the mix in order to keep the player on their toes, rather than trying to develop new lucrative ways to test the player's abilities with the gadgets they've accumulated like the later games do. But to be fair, this isn't as much of a problem in the early game as it is in the latter half though, but I still thought I'd at least mention it here when the first mutant enemy type appears. Truth be told, you don't even actually get to fight this one for very long anyway before he suffers from a heart attack in dramatic fashion and to the room's surprise. There's also this cool little moment where the Joker tests Batman's willpower in a very low-key but excellent way in my opinion. It's not played up too much, and it's very believable in the heat of the moment that Batman might have to hold himself back from doing something rash or hasty with all that adrenaline in the air. Of course, that's exactly what Joker wants Batman to do, so we know he'll never actually do it. But seeing the compassion of the Dark Knight be tested was water that most Batman games didn't want to cross at the time. So it makes it all the more brave to see Rocksteady tackling that area with head-on precision in their formative years. Plus, that's what a true comic book accurate Joker would be constantly doing in my imagination, and that's exactly what the Joker is doing here, throughout the entire game. Which is also why he's kidnapped Commissioner Gordon, presenting Batman with his second task / the second act of the night. The second act of the game is where Batman's rogues gallery is finally unchained and satisfyingly introduced to the player. At one point on Batman's journey through the asylum, Harley Quinn sabotages an elevator, causing the player to have to use Batman's master parkour skills in order to exit the elevator shaft. These climbing sections are probably the game's least polished attribute, but they aren't that bad in my opinion, and there isn't enough of them placed in the player's path at times to where they become a repetitive or overused occurrence either, so... After that sequence, however, the Riddler finally reveals himself to Batman, but more importantly, Arkham Asylum officially opens up and gives Batman and the player one hell of a view. I guess I should also mention, the Riddler doesn't actually make an appearance in this game, technically, despite the over 1,000 audio logs tied to him, but Rocksteady instead chose to tie every one of the game's 240 collectibles to him in one way or another. And don't get me wrong, that is a ridiculously absurd amount of collectibles to put in a video game in the first place, but since Rocksteady chose to design Arkham Asylum as a sort of a mini-island / hub world-like area, it means that a lot of the times collecting these trophies or solving these riddles will lead the player into an area that they haven't been before or would have never seen otherwise. But that's not a complete good thing though either, because most of these areas were only designed with the placement of a Riddler trophy in mind at the end of the day. But I have to admit, since the collectibles themselves offer such a deep insight or shed some kind of specific light onto a character's backstory, I actually ended up going out of my way to collect as many as I can, just so I could learn more about the characters and the asylum itself, even though I totally could have just used Google too, but where's the fun in that, right? I do have a completionist mindset though, so that probably plays into that factor, and it probably means that I would have done it either way if I'm being honest. But the rewards the player can get here are so much better than what other games are willing to give you. The Scarecrow sections and his overall introduction to the player in general are probably some of, if not the most memorable parts of this game. So much so that Rocksteady even went as far as to center the entire third game's plot around him. His encounters are broken up into 3 distinct sections that the player will end up running into over the course of the story, but the first one comes not too long after the asylum opens up for the first time, when Batman is investigating the medical wing of the asylum to be specific. They normally start out with Batman inhaling some of Scarecrow's fear toxin accidentally in a very low-key way. Then he and the player will slowly start to hallucinate things like endless raining hallways and bugs crawling out of the walls, things like that. But the way Rocksteady likes to mess with the player in these odd kinds of ways are the main reason why this game has so much charm in my opinion. These parts of the game are so refreshing because not only is the concept unique on its own, but the execution feels just as smooth to actually play through as well. The slow and somewhat methodical climbing tied to Batman requires the player to time their jumps and to hide behind pillars of cover in order to stay out of the light of Scarecrow's death beam-like laser eyes and avoid being reverted back to their last checkpoint. What really makes them so great, though, is how much they reside in the player's mind after the first time they experience them. I know they're fun to look back at in retrospect, and in truth an entire video could be done on them alone, but think back for a moment to the first time you, or if you happen to be in the shoes of a first-time player, about how you would feel or how you would react to this kind of scenario in a video game unfolding before you, and how special it felt after you finally caught on to the visual trickery that was being played on you and you actually got back into the video game. I mean, talk about an aha moment, am I right? The game lets you think you're still in a familiar or rule-bound space of the asylum for a minute, even going as far as to fake Commissioner Gordon's death, but then it abruptly stops fucking around and the trip turns into a bad one in the blink of an eye. During the most memorable part of the first encounter, players are prompted to open up a body bag, and in a single cinematic tilt, the body of Batman's father, Thomas Wayne, appears. Then in the next, his mother, Martha Wayne. And then finally in the third one, the chilling character model of the Scarecrow is finally presented. The environment itself even starts to tear into a giant floating island as Batman turns around with a gigantic, silhouetted scarecrow prowling overhead, and the mechanical rule here becomes brutally simple. If his searchlight finds you, you die and restart from the last checkpoint. These sequences basically turn the game into a two-dimensional puzzle platformer for a few minutes, and they're so simple but yet fun at the same time that they deserve an extra explanation. Sprint when the beam swings away, crouch behind level geometry when it sweeps back, apply explosive gel at the precise safe window, chain Batman's running jump across an endless void, and finally tip up or light the bat signal to banish the hallucination and return back to the realm of reality. The first scene in particular does a very good job of translating Batman's trauma into the story. The morgue sequence performs a simple yet rhetorical trick and then leaves you thinking and holding on to it, which is only so interesting because instead of describing the trauma in a cutscene or something like that, the game instantiates it and makes it interactive in a way that Batman media has never really tried to or been able to do before. The player doesn't just watch Bruce Wayne remember the death of his parents, they are actively forced to participate in every sensory role that makes that memory so unbearable. And this isn't even going to be the first time it happens in this game either, or in the whole series for that matter, because this aspect of who Batman is so important to him and his character. Eventually, Batman does come down from the effects of Scarecrow's fear gas, and it's revealed that Gordon didn't actually die. Batman was just tripping balls off the toxin. He's actually just being held captive by Harley Quinn, but Batman wastes no time freeing him though. Then, pretty quickly afterwards, Bane is introduced to the player as Batman and Gordon find him tied up and actively being experimented on in a very inhumane and unsanitary way. Before the game can throw you two into a makeshift environmental ring of some kind, though, the game foreshadows the Titan formula in Dr. Young by briefly mentioning that plot point here. Dr. Young and the Titan formula are essentially what the better half of Batman Arkham Asylum's story is centered around. You see, as great of a comic as A Serious House on Serious Earth was, Rocksteady and Paul Dini both had to spice things up a little bit to avoid outright plagiarizing one of the most beloved Batman comics of all time. So that's pretty much where the whole Titan formula subplot comes into play. To try to sum it up as quickly and precisely as I can, Joker not only wanted Batman to come to the asylum as a sort of a sick and twisted I told you so kind of way, but he's also secretly been working with one of the asylum's top doctors and researchers to harness the power of Bane's blood in order to raise an army of theoretical Banes to take over Gotham City. Which does sound pretty lazy whenever I lay it all out like that, but at the same time it's not really something the Joker wouldn't do. This comes at a terrific cost, though. To extract Bane's blood, Dr. Young has placed him in an elaborate set of these twisting tubes that are actively and continuously draining it out of his veins as he suffers every second of it. It's a sad sight to see, to be honest, but before Batman can cut him down or attempt to help him in any way, the Joker starts pumping the venom back into Bane's blood, causing him to break free in a fit of uncontrollable rage. This is also the event that kickstarts the Bane vs. Batman boss fight. It's a rather straightforward boss fight, design-wise anyway. My only issue here really is how much this specific moveset is given to the later brute-like enemies. I understand it makes sense because they're technically under the effects of the Titan formula that's in Bane's blood, so making them behave or act like Bane isn't out of the ordinary as far as the narrative is concerned. But I don't know, man, it just kinda feels like a cheap way to reuse enemy animations to me, from a gameplay perspective. Plus, it kind of diminishes the Bane boss fight in general, and renders the whole thing pretty forgettable once you repeat this same sequence over and over again with a bunch of nameless thugs over the course of the rest of the story that aren't bosses. Not too long after Batman sends Bane and the Batmobile to the bottom of the Arkham Harbor, though, the player is then presented with another one of Scarecrow's mini-boss fights. This is where that winding hallway I mentioned earlier is actually utilized in the narrative as well. I think the game is trying to use it to compare the Warden's overly decorated corridors with the contrast of Wayne Manor, maybe suggesting the two have more in common than meets the eye initially, but I'm not really so sure if Rocksteady or Dini was going for this here, or if I'm just reading too much into this. It's apparent that Bruce Wayne has donated a significant amount of funding to the asylum, based on how many plaques are scattered around the asylum with his name on it. Therefore, an argument could certainly be made that Batman is doing the same thing that Warden Sharp is doing. By not actively seeking out the self-improvement and betterment of the asylum, both men aren't really helping the problem so much as they are prolonging the treatment available to it. If that really is what's trying to be said here, then that genuinely is something to lethally chew on for a minute or two while the player is busy reverting back to a young Bruce Wayne, as Batman is busy fighting for his sanity again. At first, I thought the fact that Thomas and Martha Wayne were reused so much as they were and so close as together like they were somehow hindered the narrative as a whole in one way or another. But after pondering on it for a few days now, I've kind of come to the realization that this is probably the only aspect of Batman's story that I'm totally okay with being repeated. Solely due to how this is sort of supposed to represent both Batman and Bruce Wayne's unresolved trauma. And one could even make the argument that unresolved trauma is the reason Batman exists in the first place, so, like I said, I'll give it a slide. As players bravely venture down that winding hallway, it quickly starts to fill with rain as the audio of the night Batman's parents died slowly begins to play in the player's ear, with the level eventually transforming itself into Crime Alley. But it doesn't even stop there. The game even goes as far as to make the player and Batman mourn his parents before they're able to continue progressing. I feel like that too is trying to say something about the broader approach one could take when dealing with one's own personal trauma, but unfortunately, that message gets kind of hidden or muddied after the game's other more outdated takes on mental illness appear to the player. When both Batman and the player are forced to walk down that bleak hallway and abruptly relive the death of the Waynes and the birth of the Batman, then they have to literally stand up into the mantle themselves. It's probably one of my favorite parts of the entire game just because of how low-key but emotionally moving it is. It's not told through a cutscene or a comic panel, it's done through tangible player interaction. By forcing the player's hand on the controller's analog stick to enact that transformation from broken child to caped crusader, it gives the scene and overall story in general a rare kind of emotional weight that other forms of Batman media just simply can't provide because they just simply aren't able to give me that same kind of feeling that Batman Arkham Asylum does whenever I hear the thunder in the background and feel the vibration in my controller as I stand up as Batman. The small act of pressing forward on a stick and watching the camera tilt as Bruce reconstructs himself is so emotionally heavy and quietly brilliant in so many ways, and yet I never really see anybody talking about it online for some reason. For decades now, Batman's origin story has been one of the most recited stories in pop culture, replayed in comics, films, television, and even animation, but rarely has it ever been something you can participate in so actively. You can get immersed in all the Batman media that you want, but Rocksteady managed to turn the most static and retold part of Batman's story into a playable beat, and for what it's worth, they didn't fuck it up. Here, you don't just learn that trauma forged the cowl, you embody the recovery process of the cowl as well. In a medium so often accused of trivializing storytelling with interactivity, I mean hell, QuickTime events are still getting nailed to a cross for simply existing, and it's 2025 for God's sake. This is one of the first times where the two fuse together to elevate the experience of the player rather than flatten it, and I kind of wish the moment had only gotten the recognition it desperately deserves, honestly. That's also why I think this moment is, arguably, the single best sequence you could add to your studio's first Batman game, hands down. It makes the origin story feel personal again by anchoring it to the player's own movement, to their own willingness to push forward, some might even say. But other than that, that's really all that I took home from the second encounter with Scarecrow. It's more like an extended version of the first one, but with the volume and visuals cranked all the way up to 10 this time. Basically like taking 2 tabs of acid instead of 1 tab, for the lack of a better reference. I like to think that the third act of the game begins right after Dr. Young's death, and as soon as Harley Quinn reappears to announce that she's abducted Warden Sharp again, prompting Batman on another predictable chase through the asylum. Before he gets a chance to apprehend Harley again, though, she lets Poison Ivy out of her cell. This isn't much of a threat at this very moment, but Poison Ivy does become far more important to the plot later on, so I guess this is another subtle form of a foreshadowing. To almost nobody's surprise, though, Batman wastes no time rescuing Quincy Sharp and taking Harley Quinn and her goons out. The Harley Quinn boss fight itself is also pretty lackluster too, but to be fair, that could be said about pretty much every boss fight in this game. I don't really want to beat a dead horse here. This is obviously an area that Rocksteady was still working the kinks out of. Plus, most of the more intuitive players have already figured out that the third act belongs to Killer Croc, based on how he was also subtly foreshadowed at the beginning of the game. But before Batman can make his way into Croc's lair, the third and final Scarecrow encounter happens in a pretty remarkable way. Before I start discussing the third and final Scarecrow sequence, however, I'd like to break away from the story analysis part of things and to briefly touch on what I think about Arkham Asylum's depiction of the mentally disabled, if I may. Typically speaking, the realm in which characters like Batman and the rest of his odd ensemble tend to operate in normally don't really show a lot of care or dedication towards the mentally unwell. So much so that a very common retort people like to use as a means of discrediting the character of Batman in some way is that, at the most fundamental level of looking at things, Batman is just a rich guy with mental problems beating up a bunch of poor people with mental problems. I'm sure that most people don't actually believe this whenever they say it, they just like to say it as a means of rage baiting or because it sounds like a fun way to take the piss out of a character that asks you to take him seriously. But it's also a sort of compelling statement that's managed to stick around for so long because it's not totally wrong in its assessment. But keep in mind, this is mainly due to how there just hasn't been very many new renditions of the character that want to experiment in that area of things, but regardless, that's not really the argument I'm trying to make here. My whole quarrel with Arkham Asylum is very minute compared to the broader picture being presented here, but it still affected me enough and rung in my head a few days after I finished writing the script, so I thought I'd include it in here as well. And if you're still wondering what it is I'm specifically referring to, it's how Rocksteady chose to weaponize the mentally ill. To be fair though, I don't think there's anything wrong with a developer wanting to add variety to a game's enemy design, or to the game's challenge sequences. I want that to be extremely clear. Nor do I think giving an enemy a type of hindrance of some kind is bad in terms of writing. I just have a problem with how Arkham Asylum chooses to go about this, I guess. Either a little bit before or after the Harley Quinn boss fight. I can't remember which, but I guess the timing isn't really that important here. There's a part where Batman stumbles into an area of the asylum where the more violently unstable inmates who suffer from a variety of mental health conditions are being kept, and it's such an unfortunate sight for the player to see, or for them to be forced to see rather. I know that at a fundamental level this is the intent and it's not supposed to be nice looking, but they're all being kept in cage-like cells that suggest they were designed with far more animal properties in mind than that of a human one, and I don't know, that kinda just deeply irked me. It's a very brief scene too, thankfully. It can't be more than a few seconds at most, but it's still so impactful and Rocksteady manages to say so much if you are really willing to pay attention to it. You see, all the way back in 1974, the socialist Robert Martinson wrote a report titled What Works, which would later live on to be known as the Nothing Works report due to how the public went on to perceive it. The 33-page document actually puts a great deal of effort into pointing out and underlining pretty much every problem Martinson could find with how inmates both with and without mental disabilities were being treated in what was the modern-day prison system at the time, in immense detail, with Martinson even suggesting improvements in certain sections and citing over 100 other articles from psychiatrists and mental health professionals and rehabilitation experts. But surprise, surprise, Republican lawmakers didn't quite share this same view as Robert, nor did they care too much for this thoroughly researched information or analytical data that was suggesting they weren't doing a good enough job. The majority of conservative lawmakers, when this report was published at the time of course, felt that they were already sinking enough money into this obligation called the prison system. And if it wasn't working, then why even bother trying to rehabilitate criminals with mental disorders when you could much rather just warehouse them in a confined space instead? This led them to twist Martinson's report into a narrative that fit their agenda perfectly, and in the process, they were successfully able to get lobbyists on their side in this campaign as well, and without getting too far into it, they have systematically doomed how the psychologically distressed would be treated and even viewed for the better part of the next 3 decades, with some distant remnants of this still being echoed today to a certain degree, unfortunately. I feel as if Arkham Asylum is trying to reference this in a minor way. Not so much this specific event I just recounted, but rather the sentiment behind it. Throughout the entire Arkham franchise, players are never really given any kind of optimistic perspective on the Asylum's improvement, nor do they get to hear about any kind of upgrade to its outdated policies. In fact, judging by the late 1800s architecture, it seems as if nothing is going to change and everything in the asylum is designed to maintain a perpetual loop of some kind. Therefore, if the act of sending in someone with pointy ears who's dressed as a bat is one of the only things that actually works, then you might as well let him do something opposed to the countless others who would rather do nothing. This is a pretty meaningful sentiment, and dare I say, it even fits neatly within the confines of Batman's core philosophy as a hero, but then the entire message is utterly lost the second the game throws the very first lunatic at you. Like I said, something meaningful is definitely trying to be said here, and I don't necessarily think Rocksteady tried to squander it on purpose, of course, but by making the player defend themselves from an inmate who is suffering from a psychological disorder and who has most likely been abused and or tormented during their entire imprisonment at this facility, it kind of breaks the immersion a little bit, not only because I feel bad as a player for doing what I'm doing, but also because it's very out of line for Batman as a character in my eyes. This is supposed to be the same person who sat and comforted a dying little girl in her final moments, mind you, which is such an unfathomable feat of both willpower and self-control over one's emotions that I'd argue you'd be very hard-pressed to find anyone on the planet right now who could actually pull something like this off and still be able to sleep comfortably with themselves at night. So, when you remember things like this, it's a little hard for me to believe that this is that same person when he's seen here punching a mentally disabled person 2 times in the face instead of the typical 3-hit combo he dishes out to the common man. And it's also hard for me to believe that he's doing it with very much restraint or compassion in mind either, which are 2 crucial aspects that someone must take in account when writing a good Batman, in my eyes anyway. And not even to mention, there's also the fact that as long as the player behind the controller is mentally present in any way whatsoever, they're going to feel some kind of layer of disconnect applied to the game when they're asked, by the game, to harm a mentally ill person in order to continue progressing, no matter what. And if there isn't some kind of disconnect there, then that sparks a completely separate and different type of discussion that needs to be had, but I digress, that's not really for this video. I personally have family members who have mental disabilities and or require extra help that most people wouldn't typically receive when going about their day-to-day lives. This, however, does not change how I view these people, nor does it affect the ways in which I show my love to them. But at the same time, it would be very foolish of me to just pretend like other people out there in the world don't tend to think differently of them, and or judge them negatively because of these uncontrollable circumstances. So, when I'm forced to not only interact with some of the most stereotypically depicted mentally ill inmates I've ever seen in a video game, I really can't help but feel disgusted with what I'm seeing. This kind of representation of such nuanced psychiatric and psychological cases is insensitive at best, and it triggers a certain type of disgust deep within me that I don't feel was present in any other section of the game. Plus, the way Batman just body slams these inmates and subdues them with a simple swift strike to the temple just seems so out of the ordinary for a man who operates with empathy and compassion in mind above all else. With all that being said though, I don't really think Rocksteady did this with malicious intent, nor do I even think they truly realized how inconsiderate they were being in certain areas if I'm being real. I think they were mainly concerned with just spicing up the levels with new enemies for the players to fight, and they just so happened to miss the mark here from both a design and a writing standpoint in doing so, which is kinda rare in itself, so I thought I might as well point that out too, This kind of thing is expected to a certain degree anyway when making a video game though, believe it or not. In a 2011 interview with Game Developer Magazine, Rocksteady co-founder and director Seth Hill explained that the team that worked on Batman Arkham Asylum with him had to make an important choice on either focusing on a more combat-heavy brawler type of game or a more stealth-focused title when planning the original design document for Arkham Asylum. And with a team of reportedly just 40 people at the start of the game's development, they knew that they couldn't realistically do everything that they had hoped to tackle in the Dark Knight medium from the start. So they decided to instead start with what they already were familiar with and then branched onward from there. It's a pretty bold strategy to approach developing a video game with, and it obviously managed to pay off for the company in the long run, also making it one of the rarer success stories in modern gaming as well, but I digress. Truth be told, my personal distaste for the lunatics aspect of this game is heavily influenced by my own first-hand experience with people of similar disability status in my own life, and due to how I've witnessed the better half of the broader public react or mistreat them in one way or another in my own life as well. Neither of which is really fair grounds to criticize or blame Rocksteady though. Like I said, I know they didn't do any of this with any kind of malicious intent or anything like that, but I still felt like I should speak my truth about the matter regardless. The only other reason I bring this up, however, is because I wholeheartedly believe that this game would be one of the most solidly put together games I've ever played if only they had chosen to neglect this idea, like the literal hundreds of other far better ones that they chose to scrap in my opinion. But aside from that little personal gripe of mine, in many ways I still have to admit that this is one of the most thought out and well-paced games that I've ever played. I mean, I know number-based metrics aren't the most reliable things to measure video game success in because of, how review bombing is a thing after all, but there's certainly a reason why this game received so many 9.0s and 9.5 ratings from players around the globe when it originally debuted. Rocksteady undoubtedly poured blood, sweat, and tears into crafting this monolith of a Batman game, and the proof is in the pudding, to use a quote that no one has probably used in the last 10 years. Perhaps an even better and more fitting saying to use here would be, the devil is in the detail, which can't be screamed enough in these long, tall, and rambling halls of the asylum. I know I already brought up how much attention was put into the detail with things like Batman's cape earlier in the script, but you probably wouldn't believe me if I told you that the environment itself looks like it received just as much, if not more detail. And my favorite example of this is the Riddler's actual riddles that he leaves scattered around the asylum. They often task the player to do something simple like scan a painting, a specific villain's holding cell, or maybe even some of the tools they utilized on their endeavors that have now been placed behind some cheap glass casings. They aren't the most revolutionary thing ever added to a video game, I'll admit, but they do accomplish the one thing that literally every video game developer and design artist have wanted players to do since the dawn of video games. And that's, they get the player to stop and smell the roses, so to speak, rather than them just mindlessly rushing through the game anxious as all get out to get to the climax, missing all the little stuff. Sometimes, the slowest and least optimal route can often be the most necessary one to take in order to admire something. And due to how immersive Arkham Asylum is on its own, at times, this game is able to pull off the task that is seemingly more and more impossible nowadays in the era of TikTok and Instagram Shorts, and that's draw the player in. In rare instances, it even breaks that layer of immersion that it's been building, and the Scarecrow sections are the best example of this in my opinion, especially the third one too. I'm not really so sure about what to call this moment, but this moment in particular has made its way onto so many top 10 gaming lists, and for that reason alone I'm just gonna let it play out to let you know what I'm talking about.
Did anyone catch the game last night?
This Scarecrow sequence in particular pushes the game's experimental design philosophy to the highest level possible. And this idea was also the second most controversial choice made during the development process, like I briefly hinted at earlier. This clever little part where the game fake crashes almost didn't make it into the game, believe it or not. Some of the higher-ups at Eidos thought that it might reflect badly on Microsoft and Sony's hardware, or that it just might simply be too jarring for some players, but I'm so glad that it managed to slip through the cracks and remain in the game personally, because I feel as if the breaking of the player's immersion here in a significant way, only for it to be revealed as an in-game illusion, it really only reinforces the player's immersion when it's all said and done if you really think about it. I mean, can you imagine how many people out there actually had a little mini heart attack just for them to immediately be reassured that Batman's just tripping off the fear toxin? Stuff like this doesn't happen in every game out there, especially the ones that get made nowadays, so you really gotta cherish this shit while you can. By the time most players realize the crash was fake, they're already being forced to replay a bizarro version of the game's intro scene, which is just so cool. This time with Batman strapped up in the gurney and Joker under the controls of the player. The entire hard crash moment in general is such a fourth wall flourish that I really can't stop talking about it. I know the game's main goal is to dwindle down your confidence, you know, just like how the Asylum is doing to Batman's mental state right now, but the game literally tried to reach outside of my monitor in hopes of unsettling my confidence and even the software itself. That shit is so cool, man. No other video game has tried to do interactive storytelling like this, like literally none. The only other moment I can think of that compares to this in any way is when players had to unplug and reinsert their controller cords to beat Mantis in the Metal Gear Solid franchise. But I never actually played those games for myself when I was growing up, so I don't have any hands-on knowledge of that event like I do here with the one in Arkham Asylum. I'm kinda just reiterating bullshit for comparison's sake. When the hallucination finally initiates, however, the game's largest nightmare arena yet is then presented to the player. Multiple islands of the Asylum's broken apart architecture float overhead, while swarms of skeletal illusions are thrown at Batman. I know none of this is really new to the player by this point, but it is still cool. And this is when everything is really turned up to 11. I mean, I'm not gonna lie to you. It's not the best boss fight ever designed or anything like that, but it's definitely the best one in the game players have fought so far. And although it's really kind of hard to put it onto paper and explain it, it really does just kind of work. I mean, anybody who's actually played the game knows that. When players finally get the best of Scarecrow, however, he decides to run down into the sewers, and that's whenever he meets Killer Croc, as well as Batman and the player, but you know, Scarecrow's the one who nearly gets ripped in half, meaning both the Batman and the player must set their attention to Killer Croc now. His boss fight is kind of interesting because it's not the typical Bane redesign we've seen throughout most of the game. Instead, it's a different kind of environmental puzzle the player and Batman must solve in order to beat him. And by solve, I mean continuously walk forward at a steady pace with a GPS on your screen, of course. You see, the main reason Batman is even down here in Croc's lair in the first place is because this is supposedly the only area on the island where the root of a special plant can be found. One that has the possibility of destabilizing the Titan formula and maybe even curing those who have been infected by it. But Batman's job is never really that easy, of course, so while he and the player are hunting and gathering up all of these samples, Killer Croc is going to randomly appear every few minutes just to try and keep the player on their toes, I guess. I'm not going to lie. It's certainly not the most engaging boss fight ever designed or anything like that, but it's certainly a better option than giving Croc the Titan formula, so, I mean, there's that at least. The ending of the fight is rather memorable too, because when Batman first enters Croc's domain, he places some explosive gel on the exit, only for him to kite Croc into it by the end of the boss fight, which is another brilliant showcase of Batman's intellect over all else, and there's no way the player doesn't feel like a badass after that. I mean, come on, right? Not long after the Killer Croc showdown, Batman gets word from Oracle that Poison Ivy has now been injected with the Titan formula, meaning he must divert all of his attention to stopping her now in order to save the island from being overrun by these ginormous mutated vines. This is also the moment in the game where the asylum itself starts to change subtly appearance-wise as well. Technically, the Arkham estate has been changing in subtle ways ever since Batman stepped foot through those rustic gates, with my favorite example being those inmates that spend the entire time placing boards up around the visiting center waiting for the game's epic finale. But this is when those changes are the most vibrant and memorable in my opinion. For the next bit of the game, Poison Ivy's Titan-enhanced plant roots now expand and both block off certain areas of the asylum, making it a little difficult to backtrack in certain areas, with this effect only going away after Batman/the player defeats Poison Ivy. Speaking of which, the Poison Ivy boss fight is undeniably my favorite boss battle in the entire game, hands down, and I promise I'm not just saying that because of her character model. It's still not one of the most thorough or even is it a very thoughtful execution of the character's abilities in my opinion, but it's so much more refreshing to face a new enemy design after spending so many hours with the Titan-enhanced thugs and boss fights that we've seen been scattered around like zoo exhibits so far. So much so that I'm willing to give it an extra bonus point for being creative. The fight largely consists of Batman dodging Poison Ivy's vines and whatever other forces she decides to throw at him, with there being a small window of opportunity where the player can send in a few batarangs her way in order to deal damage. Like I said, the fight isn't really that bad per se, I just wish she didn't send in a bunch of mind-controlled security guards during the second stage of the fight. And oh yeah, there's a second stage of this fight too, by the way, which is a bit much in my opinion, but at the same time, I'm almost willing to overlook these minor grievances because this is the very first Batman game Rocksteady ever made. And it's kind of ludicrous for me to just expect them to instantly know how to effectively challenge the player in ways that are both reactively rewarding and mechanically simple. Basically, every time a boss fight in this game tries to up the ante, so to speak, it usually tries to do so by throwing in a large quantity of nameless goons, and maybe even a Titan Thug in the mix if you're lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. And although that method is very disrupting, later Batman games seem to figure out that there are much more impactful ways to make this happen without just bloating the battlefield. Unfortunately, this is something that's been coded into the game's DNA hard, so much so that even the final act and ending of the game suffers from this shortcoming as well. Almost immediately after defeating Poison Ivy, the Joker interrupts to inform Batman that his grand finale is finally ready, which essentially means the final mission is now available. All Batman and the player have to do now is take a stroll down to the visiting center.
Why didn't you stop Batman? Me? It was your plan, you goofy clown! I'm sending you back to the ventriloquist where you belong. You had to spoil everything, didn't you? Beating up Bane, feeding Scarecrow to Croc, slapping around Harley, my hobby, by the way, and ruining all my lovely Venom plans.
It's over, Joker.
Over? Why, my dear delusional Dark Knight, it hasn't even begun.
So yeah, this little mini-battle before Batman actually confronts the Joker is a prime example of what I was talking about earlier in the video. This is the endgame, technically speaking, and mechanically. So the way the game thinks is best to express that to the player is by literally throwing in every enemy type into one room. Normally, that wouldn't be very much of a problem. But then the actual problem arises when you come to realize that there are only roughly 7 or 8 enemy types in the entire game, excluding the special boss fights, and those designs, of course. Regardless of however you may feel about that though, it also just feels like a cheap way to delay Batman and the Joker's final altercation. But considering how that too is pretty lackluster in my opinion, I guess I kind of get why Rocksteady chose to postpone it for as long as possible. Not only does it pad out the runtime of the game, but it also saves the player from looking at whatever the fuck this is. Arkham Asylum's climax is almost perfect in my opinion, but there are still a few areas of it that didn't really win me over. And don't get me wrong, I thought the bit where the Joker abducts Jim Gordon to Batman's surprise was a really cool idea, but it's the part where the Joker tries to shoot him with a sample of the Titan formula, only for Batman to take the bullet and somehow resist the virus long enough to sacrifice the only antidote on himself. That didn't really rest well with me. It really sucks too, because this is such a good conundrum for Batman. Saving Jim Gordon is definitely something Batman would do, but I'm not so sure if he'd waste such a crucial component to his plan on stopping the Joker so easily, rather than just accepting his fate and going down with the ship, so to speak, for everybody else's betterment. I mean, the player did spend a significant amount of time preparing the serum, and Poison Ivy destroyed the ability to make another dose when she crushed Batman's computer earlier in the story, so it's no secret how vital this antidote is to the game's plot. And separating from that, can we just discuss how Batman is able to seemingly reject the Titan transformation for a second? Like, that just makes no sense to me. When Batman rejected Scarecrow's fear toxin, that made sense to me because it was like a psychological / mind over matter kind of thing, right? But earlier in the game, when inmates were shot with that same high-tech dart gun Batman is shot with, he's just somehow able to resist the literal spine-stretching transformation for almost double, if not triple the time frame of the average Joe. Like, literally, how is Batman resisting this stuff? Is it because he works out more or something? But these inmates are also pretty buff. You know, it doesn't really make any sense. Maybe I'm just looking too deep into it, but still. The Joker also injects himself with the same virus as a means of having a mutated one-on-one with Batman as to tip off the night, and as goofy as his mutated mohawk-rocking character model looks, I don't really think that aspect of the story is necessarily out of the realm of something Joker would do in the comics, but I do feel as if Rocksteady could have devised a better final boss battle if they really tried. Preferably one where the Joker is the ringleader, and maybe even a lovable cast of Batman's most notorious villains are somehow hindering the Dark Knight as well as he tries to solve some elaborate puzzle. Because when you really think about it, the Joker works best as like a spearhead, you know, he's not really the muscle kind of guy because Batman beats him in that aspect every time, just like he does in this game. But once you start to consider all these factors at once, you also start to realize that this is where Rocksteady unintentionally put themselves in a very difficult spot, one that's almost impossible to get out of. Or at least I couldn't think of any ways to get out of it personally. Which is, how on earth do you write a fun and meaningful ending to an action-adventure superhero game without the player punching the lead antagonist in the face at least a few times in the ending? I guess the real answer is you just don't. I don't think you really could if you tried, if I'm being honest. And it doesn't take a fortune teller or a magic crystal ball to predict that either. If Rocksteady would have chosen to end the game on a rather exposition-heavy cutscene, perhaps one where all the big bad guys are gathered in a room holding hands and talking about their feelings, that probably wouldn't have went over any better in the eyes of the player than the final version did. But I do low-key wish Rocksteady or Dini would have utilized a few more notable antagonists for the game's epic finale, instead of relying so heavily on a weird roid rage Sex Pistols wannabe Joker to carry all the weight. Mechanically speaking, this boss fight is just a rip-off of the final encounter the player had with Scarecrow too, which only makes it that much more dull in the process when you realize that. The actual only difference here is that the player has to press 3 more buttons in between the waves of enemies that are being thrown at them, opposed to when they had this same little shindig with the Nightmare guy. Even though Batman Arkham Asylum concludes on a rather forgettable note, I still think it's a game that succeeds in all the areas that no other superhero title was brave enough to attempt at the time. Sometimes I have to keep reminding myself that this is one of the first superhero games, and Batman games in general, to insist that wearing the cowl meant much more than trading punches with thugs and roaming alleyways. And more importantly, it meant inhabiting an identity built out of fear, discipline, memory, and compassion. I also just fucking adore the way the asylum itself functioned, and its overall portrayal. It was less of a backdrop and oftentimes felt like an antagonist itself just as much as the Joker did, forcing Batman to confront both his enemies and his own limits within the walls that had housed so many and done it for so many generations. Arkham Asylum also prospers because it ties its mechanics so tightly to its central theme. And the game articulated something no one was really expecting in 2009, which was the Batman fantasy could be just as much about the struggle of being Batman as it could about the idea of being Batman. Arkham Asylum also can't help but feel like a foundation to me either, like a chamber piece that hinted at an orchestra anxiously waiting to be revealed in the wings. I understand the game wasn't made with the idea of a franchise or multiple other projects in mind originally, but Rocksteady definitely left everything open-ended just in case they got greenlit for one. And thankfully they did. Because once you get the chance to read so many of these supervillain backstories and listen to their own personalized Arkham interviews they were forced to undergo during their time in the asylum, it really does just tend to leave you wanting more, due to how uniquely crafted this universe is, and how well it resides inside comic lines. There's also an extra challenge mode for those who get finished with the main story and still want some more Batman action. The levels themselves are just some refurbished areas of the asylum, now sized down and fitted with a brand new scoring system that not only tracks your high score, but also lets you compare it with your friends, or at least the ones that have played this specific challenge anyway. It's not like leaderboards were a revolutionary concept by the year of 2009 or anything like that, but it's still cool to see when a game caters to the more competitive kind of players out there. At least when they choose to do it in ways that don't affect the casual's experience anyway. At the time of writing this, a guy by the name of the Batman 509 is currently sitting at the top of literally most of the leaderboard rankings in this entire game, and I have to say, not only is that highly impressive and hard to do, but it's certainly the man I'd say is worthy to hold the mantle, judging him by his Xbox gamertag. The game also lets you play through these same sections as the Joker too, equipped with his own whimsical rendition of the Batman's combat style. This is a fun inclusion to the already decent amount of content offered to the player. Plus, since fans liked it so much here, it went on to become somewhat of a focus point in the later games and their respected downloadable content. With this game, Rocksteady had proven that you could take the world's most overexposed superhero and still make him feel intimate. But the very act of pulling that off left players wondering what would happen if you were to open the doors, so to speak, and let that design breathe in a much more larger, less corridor-confined space. By the time the credits roll, the fantasy of a wider, less restricted Gotham City are already looming in the back of the player's mind. And that's where Arkham City enters a few short years later, not as a contradiction of the Asylum's tight focus, but as the natural, consequential successor to it. Batman Arkham Asylum is, in the best sense, a proposition. It's a tight yet stubborn argument about what a Batman game could be when the systems that make it and the art and writing refuse to talk over one another. Rocksteady understood that inhabiting Batman required constraint, perception, and discipline, and by confining all the action the player can partake in down to a single, carefully composed island, the team was able to turn every corridor, every vent, and every gothic gargoyle statue turned predator perch into an opportunity to teach the player a verb of the Dark Knight myth. When Arkham Asylum falters, it's only because the game chooses to step so far outside of the ecosystem that it had so carefully cultivated for itself already. But in a surprise and somewhat unpredictable turn of events, the misfires themselves then work in an effort to make the successes feel rarer and stand out more deliberately. For a time, though, Rocksteady's first triumph stood as a focused, almost surgical-like reimagining of Batman, one that taught players how to be the character in ways no film or comic had ever quite allowed, despite their ruthless attempts. And that left the series' future with a clear, combustible question, one that might even be worth answering at city scale. Thanks for watching.